I was driving down the road here in Newburgh, New York, and my brake pedal went to the floor. I pulled into a parking lot, and I checked under the car, and I saw brake fluid all over the right rear tire, which is a sign that the wheel cylinder had gone bad on the right side, the rear brakes. So I drove the car home. I had enough front brakes left to make it the half-mile home, and put the car up on jack stands and started the process of trying to remove the brake drum so that I could access the wheel cylinder. Wheel cylinder is a $15 part held in place by 2 bolts, and it should take about an hour to replace it. So, here's where the saga begins. Now, this first photo is actually the left side of the car. I had already done the right side. But take us back to Sunday afternoon. It's drizzly, it's wet, and I cannot get the brake drum off of the car. I tried an improvised brake drum puller that I found on YouTube with some chains and hooks and a scissor jack, and all I did was end up bending the scissor jack. I don't have a brake drum puller. I don't have torches, so I had to cut off the brake drum, which means I'm going to have to buy a new brake drum. So here's my Craftsman angle grinder and a variety of cut-off wheels and the rusty brake drum. Now, before you use an angle grinder to cut off a rusty brake drum, use safety glasses. Here are some safety glasses. They protect my eyes. There's going to be a lot of sparks, a lot of rust, a lot of debris. Use safety glasses. Now, on the right side of the car, I hadn't cut off a drum ever in my life, so I didn't know what I was doing. Now, this is the left side of the car. This is the second one that I did. And I had learned from the right side that you've got to cut a big chunk out of the drum, and that way you can get the drum off. If you cut just a little piece, it won't be enough. Now, why does the drum get stuck? It gets stuck because it develops a groove, and the brake shoes get stuck in that groove. And it's only about a 1/16 of an inch little lip, but it holds the drum in place. It's amazing how tight the drum is and how hard it is to remove. So I cut this big chunk out, and here's my sledgehammer and chisel that I used to finish the process. And here's the big chunk out of the brake drum, and at this point I was finally able to get the brake drum off, and you'll see there's a little nick on the brake shoe and a little nick on the backing plate. But this was the side that I did second, so this is where I knew what I was doing. Here's the brake drum with a ton of brake dust and debris and rust and scale and crust. And you can kind of see the little lip that was holding it in place. It's kind of hard to see, but if you've ever done one of these, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I'm sure people will say, oh, you could have used torches. I don't have torches. You could have used a puller. I don't have a proper puller. And here's what everything looks like. Now, this is the good side. This is the side on the left that I changed proactively after I had finished the bad side. So here is the drum that I removed on the right side, which is where the wheel cylinder had gone bad. And I did this in the rain. So you can see I performed a few cuts because I didn't know exactly what I was doing. There's a ton of brake fluid and debris and grime inside this brake drum, and there's a lot of rust all over my driveway. See that sort of orange tone is just from the rust powder. I guess I didn't think to spray down the drum with brake cleaner first to get rid of some of the rust and scale. Now, here are some of the things that I used before I decided to cut. There's a chain and a hook, and that little hooked piece of metal there, that's from the scissor jack that I tried to use for the improvised brake drum puller. You can find that on YouTube. Somebody else made a video about that. I tried to use a pry bar. I don't really remember what I was doing with those weight plates, but you can see there's rust powder all over everything from where I cut the drum off. So keep in mind, this is a $15 wheel cylinder that's supposed to be replaceable in about an hour with 2 bolts. And so far, all I've done is cut off the drum, which took me all afternoon. And now here's my wet driveway. This is Sunday afternoon, wet driveway with rust all over it. Here's the next morning when it was dry. And that rust stain is still there. It'll probably be there for a year. So, before I started doing any of this stuff, I jacked up the car, and luckily the rear section of the frame has a point in the middle where you can jack it up really well, and it has two little kind of divot holes in it where you can put in the jack stand. So I have two jack stands and the hydraulic jack holding it up. And you can also see in this photo how badly I hacked up the brake shoe. This is the rear brake shoe. These are the rear brakes, but the rear brakes have a front shoe and a rear shoe. The rear brake shoe is just hacked to bits from where I cut off the drum. Now here is the wheel cylinder that failed. You can see one end of it just popped right out. I cannot fault this wheel cylinder because this wheel cylinder has a minimum of 80,000 miles on it. That's how many miles I had put on the car at this point. And it may have 294,000 miles on it. It may be the original wheel cylinder, it may not, but it has at least 80,000 miles on it. So I can't fault the wheel cylinder. It's a $15 part. Now, the shoe in the front is heavily worn, but if the wheel cylinder hadn't broken like this, I wouldn't have done this brake job. It would have been unnecessary. There's grime all over everything because the brake fluid comes out of the wheel cylinder and mixes with the brake dust and makes an awful mess. Now here's a little shot of the rear brake shoe that's all chewed up from my angle grinder and the cutoff wheel, and the main spring that holds the brake shoes in place, and the wheel hub, which is going to be important in a little while. And here's the front spring. Here's the top spring that holds the shoes also in place. Here's the other side of the top spring, and you'll see in a minute this spring is yellow. This is how dirty everything is in here. So I got myself some brake parts cleaner and a bucket to catch the brake parts cleaner. Stuff evaporates pretty well, but if you're using a lot of it, it'll drip into the bucket. There's a little bit better shot of that. Now this is after I applied some of the brake parts cleaner. It's still kind of grimy and messy in there, but you can see that the spring is yellow. And here I'm using a screwdriver, my trusty Stanley screwdriver, to pop off this spring. I do have a brake spring tool, but for some reason I decided not to use it, and I probably should have used it. It was a pain to get it off with the Stanley screwdriver. So here you can see the grimy brake adjuster, and the shoes are starting to come off. Here I am popping off the spring with my screwdriver, the bottom spring, the front bottom spring. It's actually just one spring and it fits into the shoes. And it's in there pretty tight. It's got a lot of tension on it. So, here's the rear shoe removed, there's the adjuster poking out, and there you go. Your dirty, filthy, grimy brake adjuster out. And the front shoe is held on to the parking brake bracket with what's called a horseshoe clip. And I had to reuse the old horseshoe clip because the parts store did not have a new one in stock. So there's the horseshoe clip, and we'll get back to that in a bit. Now behind the backing plate, here's the back of the wheel cylinder, and that big bolt is for the brake line, and that little star-headed bolt, that's called an external Torx. That's one of the two bolts that holds the wheel cylinder in place, and that really made this job into a huge pain, and I'll explain why in a minute. So here I am with my 11mm gear wrench getting rid of the brake line. If you don't have gear wrenches, get yourself a set. They're fantastic. So right here you can see that there's not a lot of clearance between the backing plate and the spindle. So while I was able to get the gear wrench in to get to the brake line bolt, I would not be able to get a socket in there to access the bolts that hold the wheel cylinder in place. Now, Amazon has a special wrench. It's called an external Torx wrench for this application. But I didn't want to wait a couple of days, and I knew there was not going to be anybody around locally who had that wrench. So I was going to have to use a socket, which I was going to have to find, and I was going to have to take the backing plate off of the car so that I could get the socket in there. So here is the brake line removed, and it has these two copper washers. These are compression washers. These serve as sort of a gasket so the brake line doesn't leak. And you normally want to use new compression washers, but I didn't have new ones. The new wheel cylinder didn't come with new ones, so I reused the old ones. Here is the wheel cylinder from the behind with the brake line removed, and it looks from this angle like you could get to those little bolts with a socket, but you absolutely can't. Now, this is an interesting photo because this is the Lyle 26750 external Torx socket set. But before I got this, first I walked to the parts store because the car was on jack stands and I didn't feel like taking a bicycle. The parts store had a socket set, not this one, and it was a little cheesy and it was overpriced. It was like $40. It had a whole bunch of sockets in it. It had way more than I needed. It had a bunch of deep sockets. So I decided to keep going from the parts store to Sears, which is another couple of miles away. So I walked all the way to Sears, and they had a whole comprehensive set for like $29.95, 42-piece set, including a ratchet, an extension, a bunch of sockets. But it was garbage. It was just cheap Chinese garbage. So for $22, I decided to buy this Lyle made in USA, much higher quality, external Torx socket set. So at this point, just to get back to my house where I have this socket set, where I have the socket that I need to get to the bolts, to loosen the bolts, I've already walked like 6 miles, maybe 7 miles to the parts store and then all the way to Sears. So to replace my $15 wheel cylinder, now I've had to cut off my drum, which adds drums. And if I'm doing all that on one side, I got to do it on the other side. 6 or 7 miles of walking, $22 for this Torx socket set. So this isn't exactly a $15 1-hour job like it should be. Now, back to work. Here's a shot that I took just so I could see exactly how this spring goes when it's time to put it back together. There's a little bracket, and there you can see the parking brake cable. So, in order to get the backing plate off of this car, I have to remove the hub. Now, if all you want to do is replace your wheel hub, which includes this could be called a wheel bearing, a wheel hub. It's got the bearing unit inside there. You don't have to take the brake shoes off to do this job. But I guess you would have to cut off you'd have to cut off the drum unless you had another way to get the drum off. You can stick a socket through that hole in the hub and access those bolts while the brakes are still in place, which is good. It makes the car more serviceable that way. But I had the whole thing apart, so I decided to just go ahead and use my Craftsman Professional 10mm wrench. It was a fantastic wrench. And the bolts came out pretty easily. Here's one of the bolts after I got it loosened. You can see it's really grimy in there, but it came out without too much effort. Now on the back of the hub, where it fits into the spindle, there's some kind of sensor, so I had to remove that clip, which is kind of a pain. Getting up in there and popping the clip off, those things are always a hassle. So now here's the tire back on the hub, because the hub was kind of stuck in there. The hub is steel or iron and the spindle is aluminum and things kind of corrode together. So the old trick that I learned when I was working in a shop is we'd have the car on the lift, firmly supported. We put the wheel back on and hit the back of the tire with a sledgehammer. So since this was in my driveway, I just put the tire back on and I kick the tire, kick on the edge of the tire so it'll put a little leverage and a little sudden force, like a little impact. And you got to be real careful doing this. You got to make sure that the car is jacked up and supported and solidly supported, because if you're kicking the tire, you know, the car could come off the jack stands. But a couple of swift kicks to the side of the tire, and voila, the whole thing pops right off. And now I have the backing plate with the hub still kind of fused to the backing plate. See, I got to go through all this just to get to that little wheel cylinder, that little $15 part. What a pain. So now here's the back of the backing plate, and I did not remove the parking brake cable because that would have just been a huge pain. No need to do extra steps because there's enough steps involved here. And here, finally, I have access to these two little bolts. Now, in retrospect, maybe I should have waited a couple of days and bought the tool, bought the right wrench on Amazon. But at least this way I can make a how-to video of how to do a bunch of stuff you don't need to do. So here I am using a hammer and screwdriver, another screwdriver, to separate the hub from the backing plate, and that was pretty easy. And now here you go, your backing plate with your old busted wheel cylinder and your old crusty spring. And finally, I can put one of those Lyle sockets onto my trusty Craftsman 1/4-inch ratchet. This is a fantastic ratchet. And get that wheel cylinder out of there. There it is. This is the culprit that led to all this work, cutting off a brake drum, removing the hub, walking all around town trying to buy sockets. This little, I would call it a pretty reliable part because it lasted at least 80,000 miles for $15. So here's how the parking brake cable connects. I took that photo just so that I would have a reference. Here's your horseshoe clip, and now I'm finally ready to start reassembling all this crap. Pry off the horseshoe clip. Use needle nose pliers to get it the rest of the way out of the way. There's your front brake shoe, which is heavily worn, unevenly worn too, which is understandable because the wheel cylinder is pushing on the top of the brake shoe, not the bottom. And here's a box of new brake shoes. This is where Chevy gets points because all the brake shoes are identical, which means you can use any brake shoe. Just reach in the box and grab one, front or rear. I mean, they're rear brakes, but like I said, they have a front and a rear shoe. They're identical. So I don't know why Chevy made it easy to service that you can remove the hub without removing the brakes, easy to service that you don't have to worry about front and rear brake shoes, but hard to service in that there are two little external Torx bolts that you can't get to holding the wheel cylinder in place. I guess Chevy's batting 2 out of 3. So, little bit more brake parts cleaner to clean this stuff up, because it's still filthy. And now that I got it wet with the brake parts cleaner, I got out I guess you call this a wire brush, stainless steel bristles, one of these cheap little brushes from Harbor Freight, and cleaned it as well as I could. So now here I have installed the front brake shoe with your horseshoe clip. I decided to spring for new springs because they were $12 and that's enough for both sides. Now why would I do both sides when only one wheel cylinder broke? Well, because now the right side is going to have brand new brakes and the left side is going to have, 80+ thousand mile old brakes because I've put 80,000 miles on the car and I don't know when they did the brakes before. So I've got everything apart, I've got all the tools out, I've got all the equipment out. I might as well do the wheel cylinder and the brakes on the left side in addition to the right side. So the spring kit is about $12 and it includes springs for both sides and they're nice and shiny and new. And here I am using my trusty Craftsman ratchet and my new Lyle socket to install that new wheel cylinder. There it is on the backing plate. It's clean. It's looking good. I've installed the new spring. I'm installing the hub with my 10mm gear wrench. Again, if you don't have gear wrenches, buy them. I'll put a link in the description. They're fantastic tools to have. there it is, hub installed, backing plate installed, wheel cylinder installed, lower spring installed. And this starts, for me, an hour-long process of trying to figure out how this stuff goes back together, because I hadn't done drum brakes in 15 plus years. So it's not rocket science, this is not difficult, but you got to figure out where everything goes, or else you're going to get confused. So here I have both shoes in place, and believe me, I had to refer to the photos a bunch of times. That's why I take these photos in the first place. Now here's the brake adjuster, which I've cleaned as well as I can. And the part where it pivots is totally clean. It's still in good shape. It's just kind of a little dirty. So I've installed the brake adjuster and the little brake adjuster clip tang thingy. Here's a better shot of how that fits in there, but don't trust my photos to see how it fits. When you disassemble yours, take your own photos, look how everything fits, because you'll thank yourself when you have something to refer to. And here's that nice brand new yellow spring, which I think I installed with the screwdriver and some pliers, so I probably should have used the brake spring tool. Otherwise I wouldn't have scratched it up so much. And there it is. This is the result of hours and hours of cutting the drum and walking around to buy tools and referring to the photos I had already taken and cleaning and unbolting things. It took forever to get to this point. Now luckily, when I did the other side, it took me an hour from start to finish because I had learned everything I needed to know by doing this side. So here's everything, new parts, clean, everything ready to go. There's my nice new shiny drum, $35, and I had to buy another one for the other side. And everybody knows when they ship these drums from the factory, they put a little light oil on them so that they don't rust in transit or in storage. So you got to take some brake parts cleaner and a rag and just clean the inside surface of the drum. And you'll notice I'm using a different brand of brake parts cleaner because I ran out. I went through like 2 cans. I mean, you go through a ton of this stuff when you're doing these filthy brake jobs. So here is a nice shot of me adjusting the brakes. Now, there's like a little kind of ratchet wheel on the brake adjuster, and what you do is you adjust the brakes out, and you put the drum on, and you spin the drum, and you keep adjusting the brakes out until the drum has some friction dragging against the brake shoes. You don't want the drum to be able to spin freely, but you don't want it to be locked in place either. So you want it to just have some drag, so when you spin it, it doesn't spin freely, but it's not locked in place. And some cars you can access this from behind. But on this car, it's a sealed backing plate. It's a sealed system, so you have to do the adjustment. And I think the way it works is as the brakes wear out, the car kind of auto-adjusts. But you have to get the adjustment right at first, so the brakes won't work at all. So you just keep adjusting. You put the drum on, you check it for drag, you pull it off, you adjust it, you put it on. And when you feel just enough drag, then you got it right. Now here is my beautiful new drum, all wrapped up and all tidied up, and man, what a saga it was to get to this point. I mean, this is like the late afternoon of day 2, after tons of walking around, after you know because I didn't have a car to drive to the parts store, to drive to Sears, and I didn't feel like taking a bicycle because bicycles are kind of a pain. And just cutting the thing off, and now I know I got to do the other side too, because you can't just do one side. So this $15 part that's supposed to be an hour-long job just turned into a saga. Now here is the back of the wheel cylinder after it's been installed. And here's the brake line, which I've cleaned up as well as I can. I'm going to use those same compression washers, those copper washers, and make sure you get that right. And luckily, I was able to tighten it down to the point where, it didn't strip the threads. Like, you got to be careful with this stuff because some of these bolts are aluminum, some of the parts are aluminum. So you don't want to strip anything, but you don't want to put it on there loose so then it leaks. So if you have a leak, you got to tighten things further. And there's the brake line with the copper washes on both sides of the bolt. And now there it is installed. And I think that is the end of the job. That's 74 photos in. Now, at this point, obviously you have to bleed the brakes because there's no brake fluid in the system on this side and there's going to be air in the system. So I ended up bleeding all 4 brakes. And I'm not going to go through a how-to on how to bleed brakes. You can find that somewhere else. This was all the mechanical stuff. The bleeding brake process was really, really easy. And then I had to, well, before I bled the brakes, I had to do the whole job on the left side, which was also pretty easy because I learned so much doing the right side. Then I had to bleed the brakes. I bled all 4 wheels just to be safe and made some minor adjustments. And since then, the brakes have been working pretty well. They work a little bit better than they did before because I think before I was pretty much relying on my front brakes because the rears are so worn out. But this is a job that I would not have done if the wheel cylinder had not failed because the rear brakes were usable. But since the wheel cylinder failed, and it's a $15 part, and it's 2 bolts, and it should take about an hour to replace, I figured why not? And what it turned into was this epic saga where I had to cut off both drums, I had to replace everything on both sides, and when all was said and done, including the drums, the wheel cylinders, the pads, the springs, brake fluid, the sockets, and assorted other sundries, I'm into this job for $210 in parts. So that's a complete rebuild of all the back brakes, including wheel cylinders, for $210 in parts. And, you know, if I had had all the tools I needed, if I had had everything around, if I hadn't had to walk to Sears, it probably would have only taken me, 3 hours. Like, if I had to do this job today, considering what I learned doing it, this time, it would probably take me 3 hours from beginning to end. It's not that complicated a job. It just kind of got complicated. So, $210 in parts, 3 hours. I don't know what they would charge to do this at a shop, but I'm guessing it would be upwards of $500 because it's pretty much entire rear brake rebuild. So, $210 in parts. I got wheel cylinders and brand new rear brakes. Would I have done it if the wheel cylinder hadn't popped? No, but sometimes you have to do what you have to do. So 2 days of my life, $210 in parts to replace a $15 wheel cylinder. And it was a great learning experience, and I hope that you have learned something too. So thanks for watching, and good luck out there.